Welcome to In These Times, a multi-platform podcast and YouTube broadcasting channel for mental health issues. We want to address mental pain and emotional suffering by bringing you information that can alleviate your distress. And you may make some important mental shifts that bring back your light, your love, your hope. Please use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know your deepest troubles and concerns with your mental health. Help us to help you. Now, does anyone care about misogyny apart from women? And do we even know what it means? Misogyny is violence, hate, and harassment directed specifically at women by men. But this understanding of misogyny is really quite modern. Misogyny can take brutal forms of rape, domestic violence and abuse, female genital mutilation, and sexual harassment in the workplace. It can even happen in public spaces, such as walking in streets or parks at night. It's present in gender pay gaps and career discrimination. Its violence is saturated in young male culture, such as porn, violent video games, and urban music. It can even be seen in government ministers, the police, and judges. They have no legal punishments to deter men from such actions, and they appear not to understand the trauma of rape, groping, or the harassment and assault of women. Recent protests in the UK about the murders of Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa forced the question of misogyny back into the public forum. But feminism and the Me Too movements have failed to stop the problem. So is it time for men to give an explanation and an account for their behaviour? Well, with us to help us understand this misogyny is Previn Karian. Now, Previn, somebody said on a sort of slightly lighter note before we get into this that they described it as the oldest human prejudice. And there are lots of references throughout history to it, starting with Adam and Eve, where Eve copped all the blame for what happened to them. And Plato said that men should stick with intellect and women with sexuality. So I think that says it all, really. But of course, of recent times, it has come to something truly horrible for women in terms of terror and hate and aggression and violence. And so we are talking about real hate from men to women, aren't we?
Yeah, and those references to Plato and Adam and Eve are absolutely right, because once again, the problem of misogyny cannot be solved by looking at it as a cultural issue or something you can legislate against, although there urgently needs to be legislation to stop men being misogynistic and conducting the hate crimes that they do. But it is a psychological problem, Chrissy, and it is a mental health issue. And once again, because the pharmaceutical industry don't have a drug that can cure us of misogyny, it doesn't appear anywhere in psychiatric manuals, but it is a disorder because it is a state of mind, specifically in the male brain, that feels a need to terrorize women, to humiliate women, because actually, when you strip away all the machismo of the male persona, when you strip away all this bravado and posturing that men do, they are very scared brains inside the male skull. And this is something that needs to be understood without trying to shame men, by the way. This is not an occasion to simply attack men. What we need to do is try and ask ourselves, where is the problem of misogyny located? And it is clearly not in the law, it is clearly not in culture, it is somewhere in the human brain. This need from men to attack women in this way, which indicates that actually the fundamental root of this is men are terrified by women.
So they are emasculated, are they, by women? That's what we do to them.
It isn't what women do to men. It is something more fundamental than that, Chrissy. So around 15 years ago, I went to a seminar up in London at a Lacanian centre. And somebody called Jean-Jacques Burstein from Paris came over. And he was talking about Lacan's idea from Freud that men think of themselves through their genitals, okay, which is the penis and the phallus. And so men actually think like that. And Bernstein made this incredible comment, and he said, that's why men are dickheads. Okay? Now, I took that away as something way more profound than men being dickheads. What it told me was that women can give birth to children. Men will never do that. Women have a relationship with the earth and with cooking in their stereotypes. Men rarely do. Men don't have a fundamental relationship with life. They have short, shriveled phalluses for most of the time. They can't experience sexual pleasure like women can. They are inferior. They can't give birth to a child. They don't know what giving birth to life means. Men, psychologically and biologically, do not have a relationship with life. That's why they are terrified of women. It's not about emasculation. It's about the fundamental biological, psychological makeup of men. They are terrified. They are inferior species.
The thing is, there are lots of grades of misogyny, it seems to me, and we will look in a minute at what happens in the case of rapes and killings, which are truly terrible in society, and I think everybody agrees. But on a lesser level, I think having worked in an industry where it was perfectly normal to go around pinching a girl's bottom or make comments about how she looked or grope her. And I do remember occasion when I was reading the news on radio, and there was a panel between us, a glass panel, and the man dropped his trousers, and just to see if I'd go on reading the news. Did I go and complain? Did I take them to a tribunal? No, because I needed the job. So are we not making all too much fuss of the slightly lesser grades of misogyny?
The microaggressions that you're talking about are quite tragic, and it's actually quite painful to hear you saying, I needed a job. Okay, that's hideous that women have to put up with this kind of behaviour, not just because they need a job, but actually because society tells them, oh, this is so funny, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, let's reverse the situation. If men found that foul, repulsive women came up to them and pinched their bottoms and made leering comments and groped their penises inside their trousers, do you honestly think, Chrissy, that men are going to sit there and go, this is so funny, I won't complain, I just need to do that for my job? No, men would probably physically slap the woman back. They would be angered and outraged. Imagine a woman saying to a man, you men, you have small penises most of the time. Do you think a man would find that funny? No. He would find it a deep insult because it strikes at the root of his inferiority. Now, why is it that men don't have to tolerate that kind of abuse? Why is that not a social norm? But it's okay for women to be subject to that kind of constant abuse and harassment. It's in the newspapers, Chrissy.
Yes,
it's constant.
It's
There's body shaming that goes on with women.
Yes. And of course, there are, even this week I was reading about some quite well-known man who was said to be a bit handsy. This is the new word. So this means that they kind of grope, and that's sort of all right, because we aren't going to take them to court over it, but we'll all sort of have a laugh behind our hands at it. This is even women taking that view because that person's well known, that man. So we aren't prepared. Look at the Me Too movement. They said, right, they've actually had some success. They're prepared to sacrifice getting jobs to stop men groping them and taking them to bed.
Yes, and that's why misogyny is a very new idea. And because it's been foundational even in religions, the adulteress in the Old Testament gets stoned to death. Nothing for the man, nothing at all, okay? And that attitude symbolises something foundational in a lot of religions. Now, of course, people now in modern society are realising that we've got to move on from this. Why? Because women are seen as equal human beings to men. And that strikes terror at the heart of men. You've got a very populist psychologist called, clinical psychologist, called Jordan Peterson. And he's massively successful because he's reinforcing this idea that women are inferior, want to be slaves, like to use sexual manipulation to get men to do what they want. And what he's reinforcing in men is We are terrified of women. We need to stay superior. And that isn't a view that most modern women, educated women, are going to tolerate, because they are going to feel like, actually, I'm a human being like you are, and you don't have the right to grope me. You don't have the right to be handsy. And sadly, the people who are going around laughing behind their hands and talking about handsy stuff are people who tragically need to keep their jobs.
Well, if we go up a grade to something that's extremely common, and that's domestic violence. So 1 in 4 people across the world will have physical violence from a partner. 1 in 3 will have sexual violence. Police get 100 calls an hour just in the UK alone. I mean, it's not only that, but apparently there's so many people having to be rehomed. It costs an absolute fortune. So it's a real epidemic, domestic violence. And I'm wondering, we're not all stupid women when we meet men, and men can be extremely charming. We don't know that they're going to start attacking us and hit us because we say the wrong thing. Why does it happen?
Because it's not the woman's issue. It's not the women's fault. There is something wrong with men. And women cannot solve the problem. Feminism has tried and failed because men have to find the psychological ability to look at their brains and ask themselves, why do I have this need to physically beat up a weaker woman? Why? Why do I feel that compulsion or right that I can act like this?
Well,
and it's a men's question to themselves. It's nothing that women should be asking men. It's something men should be asking each other and themselves.
But a lot of men, I mean, even men who serve on quite important city boards will say, oh, no, we don't want too many women. They talk too much, they're difficult. And going back to the domestic violence situation, they don't want to be contradicted. They don't want to be told what to think or what to do. Men want to rule, the sort of patriarchy. They want to be in charge.
It's more than that. It is a patriarchy, and that's my point about the psychological illness in men. Men are profoundly inferior and profoundly aggressive, and that's biologically wired into their brain. And that's why they go around causing wars. That's why they go around destroying other nations, because men have something seriously unevolved and unadapted inside their brain structure.
How did it get there?
It's a biological need, but for some reason, and I really can't explain it, the male species is unlike any other on the planet. There is no other animal that acts towards its own kind, and kinship is a key thing in biology, okay? There is no other animal on the planet that acts to its own kind the way the male brain acts towards its own kind. What the male brain does is seriously mentally disordered. And if you don't understand it as a mental illness and keep just trying to find laws and talk about culture, you will not even come close to the problem because it's a psychological disease.
Laws they are trying. The Domestic Abuse Act of 2021 in the UK, and even the EU is trying to persuade its 27 members that hate crime should be on their treaty. So, whether they'll do any good, I don't know, but it's window dressing perhaps.
Well, let me give you an example of something that's very common in terms of what actually happens if a woman can get her case in law, okay? And I'm going to take an example from France so that we don't just batter the UK and help to understand that this is actually deeply cultural, this violence towards women from men, okay? It's a male brain disorder. So there's an Olympic judo gold medalist in Paris. Her name is Margot Pinault. She's 27 years old. And she gets beaten up by her partner, who is her trainer. And so they were lovers. And he attacks her at her flat. Now, he wrestles her to the ground, verbally abused her, punched her many times, repeatedly smashed her head on the ground, and tried to strangle her. Facial injuries included a fractured nose. Neighbours helped her escape. The judge said there's not enough evidence for guilt. So you can pass as many treaties as you want. This problem of the brain in the male species occurs in judges. It occurs in politicians. It occurs right across every spectrum because it isn't a class issue. It's not a religious problem. It's a brain disorder in men.
All
It's
men? Are you saying it's all men?
Absolutely, Chrissy, in myself as well. I am a man and I have aggressive male instincts. And the only difference perhaps between me and my own darker self is that I have the ability to admit that to myself. And then I want to confront it. And I want to ask myself, why would I, and why maybe if I could access them, why would I have sexual violent fantasies towards women? Why do I need that? Why do I feel the need to put women down? Why do I have the need to think of them as inferior? And I can come up with some kind of psychological explanation and say yes, because I don't have a relationship with life as a man. I have not got the same relational ability as women who are bio-wired to give birth to babies, to raise them up. Men never do that. They don't come close. We don't have the brain wiring to do life, and we don't have the brain wiring to do relationship. Those, for men, are acquired traits, and it comes through a huge amount of relational interaction, and thank God, through psychology and psychoanalysis, we can now start asking questions. Men can start asking themselves questions that have never been asked before about why are we so violent as a species?
Well, I fear the figures are showing not enough of them are asking the questions. But if we we have a lot of people who watch in these times in South Africa, a lot across Africa and all the world, actually. But I mentioned South Africa because we recently talked to Emily O'Ryan, and she was talking about work they'd been doing there because the problem is so bad of misogyny in South Africa. So let's hear from her. One of the factors which I'd like to talk about, because it affected you as, well, reasonably young, and that's the violence in South Africa, which children face every day, and during lockdown was no exception. Can you just talk a bit about the violence, the gender violence, and how it affected you?
Yes. Well, South Africa is unfortunately got the unwanted reputation of being unsafe for many females in terms of rates of violence against women. And here we call it the second pandemic. Gender-based violence is the second pandemic in South Africa.
So if we go up the scale now to the very, very worst form where people get murdered, raped and murdered, like Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa. Are we honestly going to say that those killers had a mental disorder? Isn't there something even worse about them?
Yeah, we are tempted, aren't we, to go towards a moral judgment and call them evil. And then we lurch into this idea that if we punish them, therefore, that somehow solves the problem of the male brain that has violence wired into it. It doesn't. I mean, let me just read out some more examples. There were so many I could have brought into the interview. I was actually quite overwhelmed. 2 Metropolitan Police officers, Dennis Jaffa, Jamie Lewis, circulate pictures of 2 dead sisters stabbed to death in a park. And they circulate those pictures to friends with jokes. Now, is that not mentally disordered? How could you not say that there is some kind of mental disorder, mental illness in men? And I want to generalise it out to men, because those metropolitan officers are not alone. I could have been one of them. I could have been a sadistic, abusive, murdering, women humiliating person.
So what was the difference then? Why aren't you?
The problem, well, with good fortune, I've been able to have mostly a psychological education, and the literature that I was exposed to when I was actually 14 years old with Freud and Jung. So I very quickly learned that most problems or most of my anger and hatred were actually about me. Okay, they weren't about white people. They weren't about not being able to get a job. Those factors had a play, but that was not really what was going on. There was something that I had to continuously work out about where I was psychologically. Now, that's a very lucky escape. Most men are not encouraged to think psychologically. They're taught to block it. They're taught to be manly.
So those men that killed those girls, Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, Did they get off on it? Was it a buzz? Was there sexuality involved? What kind of people do things like that other than misogynists? I mean, as well as misogynists.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? That misogyny is a mental disorder. And if you classified it as that, you could easily say, well, clearly, men who circulate pictures of stabbed sisters are mentally ill. And if you were able to say that, you might get closer to trying to solve the problem, which would then be what? Because there is no drug, is there? So what would the solution be? And the answer is that you would have to engage them with their own brains, psychologically. And that's back to therapy. And that's what we're trying to say here, is that mental health has to expand into social issues. It can't just be therapy for people in a room. These issues, such as misogyny, are going on all the time because there's mental illness at large, and men have been allowed to get away with it. And at some point, men have got to confront themselves as men and ask ourselves collectively as men, what the hell do we think we're doing?
Well, I speak as a mother, and I think we do have a responsibility in this. We must have, since all the famous psychologists reckon things start in the first 6 years of life. I mean, how do you bring a boy up to respect women or even like women?
Yes, and there you start to get to the foundations, Chrissy, and get to the heart of the question. So there is a way, and the standard response from a psychotherapist would be that the way a boy and a young infant learns to love women will be twofold. First of all, and the primary one, will be the relationship of the father or other men towards his mother. And if a boy grows up seeing men respect the mother, treating her with civility, not putting her down with verbal or physical abuse and mentally humiliating her, then a boy will model himself on that. But then where are the fathers who do that? Okay, so most of the time the fathers can contain their behaviour. Okay, we can all do it. I can do that. I can act like a civilised adult male. But that doesn't really deal with the deeper, darker instincts that I could have if I'm not watchful of it.
So, Previn, let's look at children who have access to social media and can watch porn and porn violence anytime they like. That must have an effect.
There is a problem with social media in that sense, that there is a dark side and a light side to social media. In a positive sense, you can have a lot of group formation, particularly with young people, who are massively neglected by society, who really could not care less about their mental health. So they are left to fend for themselves psychologically. They're psychological orphans trying to find each other and make friends. Now, if those groups have civility and values which aren't violently driven, then you're okay. But if, for example, children do get involved in groups with sexual violence online, I'm afraid, Chrissy, there is no simple answer to that. You can legislate against it, you can try and use internet security measures, but this is something that is out in society happening to young people. So we need to understand the problem in society. And the problem in society is the inferiority, psychological inferiority of the human male brain.
So it normalises forced sex with women and violence if you feel like it.
Sadly so. There is rape culture and rape porn. And it's also present in a lot of music, notoriously and famously with hip hop and rap, apparently trying to keep it real. Now, you can imagine that women are not going to respond very positively to this kind of feeling that is generated in men. And so what happens is these men become more and more sexually alienated, emotionally alienated, and then they start to complain about it. But it doesn't occur to them, and of course it wouldn't, that their hatred of women, because they're actually sexually inferior, because they're emotionally bankrupt and haven't got a clue about relationships, is what's driving women away. And so men don't get to that point. Instead, you do get all kinds of coaching. Years ago, I heard about somebody called D'Angelo, who was encouraging young men and young boys to be confident in their sexuality and go up to women and demand the relationship and look strong, because women want strong men. No, they don't. They want emotionally intelligent men who have the capacity to relate. Now, this is part of the problem, because also a lot of women do accept humiliation. They think it's the norm. They think it's okay to be put down, shouted at, abused, made to give birth to children and work while, the father or the other male partner does nothing. In some cases, the male partner leaves them as single parents. And that's all supposed to be okay, and you just get on with it as a woman. Why should it be? When are men going to look at their psychology?
Well, when women make enough fuss about it. But if we could come to a group called the incel movement, they hit the headlines recently because a man in Plymouth went balmy with a gun, went dangerously violent with a gun, and killed his mother and others. Now, they said he was a member of the incel group who complained that they can't get sex with a woman.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? So you actually have a situation where men are saying that they are involuntary celibates. They aren't choosing to be celibate. They are forced into this position. Basically, what they're trying to say is because of those horrible feminists have helped women to ask the question, why are you putting up with this abuse? And saying no to it. And it doesn't occur to these people that men are the problem. They are emotionally unintelligent. In fact, worse, they're emotionally sadistic towards women. And that is a psychological problem. Now, until psychotherapists engage with society and start pushing these issues out there as psychological mental illnesses, nobody is going to change. I'm really sorry to say, you can put all the laws in the world, you will not stop groups like the incel movement, and it was a movement for a while, that generates what? It generates hatred, it generates aggression, it generates violence. Now, you talked about him killing his mother. There's another horrible example in the US of somebody called Adam Lanza who shot up children in a primary school, but prior to that, he shot his mother in bed and then went to the school that she taught at and shot loads of primary school children, okay? Not even a flicker of change in the gun laws. Now, gun laws aside, you think about what occurs in the brain of a young boy that he thinks he has the right to shoot his mother in the head. That's the male brain, okay, right there. And we have to kind of work out as men. It really isn't going to help if women do make a fuss. Men have got to wake up with some kind of moral conscience almost and say, what on earth are we doing? What is psychologically wrong with us? And what do we need to change in our brain wiring so that we stop all this war, hate, aggression? Oh, I'm such a tough man. Because you know what? You're not. You don't have any relationship with life. And that is a profound male problem.
Well, feminism didn't do it, and I wonder who actually would make a difference. Who would these people... I mean, you're talking about millions of men across the world who think like this. What is going to make the difference? Who is going to?
Yeah, and this is where I have to default back to Freud and his late works, where he did get very disillusioned with the social potentials of psychoanalysis. And the very, very famous works, for those who read Freud famously, The Future of an Illusion and Civilization is Discontents, where Freud comes to this very sad conclusion that society is not going to change. Sorry, our brains have not evolved. We are incapable of being civilized. We can put a paper cracker, we can plaster the cracks, we can cover it all up with thin paper. And Freud was saying, sorry, the way society organizes itself is so psychologically ignorant. It is so naive. And he was trying to say, look, there's no excuse anymore to pretend we don't understand that aggression is a psychological problem. And he was saying, but I don't think we can get past it. And there's a very moving historical moment, Chrissy, when Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Freud and asked him would he be a signatory to the United Nations, or the League of Nations as it was called back then. And there's an agonizing letter, reply from Freud, and it's called Why War? Warum Krieg? And it was written in 1932. And Freud is saying to Einstein, I get your aspiration. Do you honestly think a League of Nations is going to stop war, the menace of war? Do you honestly think that passing laws and having an institution will stop violent aggression? And then he goes on to say, we have not evolved. We are and he's talking about men, we are an unevolved, damaged, brain-damaged species. Freud had tried psychoanalysis, and all he got was backlash during his lifetime, discrediting, of course, they had to, and huge amounts of attack. And even today, psychoanalysis is rejected by society. And Freud was saying to Einstein, what chance do you honestly think we have? Now, I don't know, because who controls the force of history? You know, none of us. We can't control our destinies, and we don't have the power to change histories across the world. But we have to, at some point, men have to face our own shadows. We have to face our own dark instincts. I have to face my violence as a male. And I have to ask myself, what on earth do I do with it, and why is it there? Because I can't keep living like that. I can't keep living from there. Now, I may be able to paper it over with this very clever psychoanalytic persona, and I can look at all my toolkit and say, oh, yes, well, I understand I'm a horrible man. I am a horrible man, like every other man. I'm not pleasant inside. And we as men need that psychological moment, which absolutely has not happened, as feminism did, not to go on because women are telling us how awful we are, okay, but some kind of evolutionary moment where men think to themselves, we are sick. We are sick. And we need to face this sickness. It's a mental disorder.
Previn, it sounds like very important stuff, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Chrissy.
In These Times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. Please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. Please also make a donation so we can go on bringing you more broadcasts. Help us to help you.